Elizabeth Whitmore did not cry. Not when Nathaniel Carter pulled the ring from her finger in front of every powerful family in Virginia. Not when the room went silent. Not when her mother made a sound like something inside her had broken. She simply lifted her chin, smoothed the front of her dress, and looked at the man she had trusted with every quiet hope she had ever carried, and she let him see that she was not afraid of him. Not anymore. If you're new here, subscribe and follow this story all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Virginia summer, 1966. The heat that evening was the kind that settled into your bones and refused to leave. The kind that made men loosen their cravats when they thought no one was watching, and made women fan themselves behind gloved hands and pretend they weren't miserable. Carter Hall had been dressed for the occasion, candles burning in every window. The long drive lined with carriages from 3 counties over the kind of gathering that only happened when a family wanted the whole of Virginia society to witness something. The Carters always did like an audience. Elizabeth had known something was wrong before she ever set foot inside. She told herself later that she should have listened to that feeling. That tight, quiet pull in her chest. That started the moment her father's old carriage rolled through the iron gates and she looked up at the house blazing with light. She had dressed carefully. The pale blue gown her mother had pressed twice. Her grandmother's pearl earrings. Her dark hair pinned smooth. She had wanted to look right for him. She had wanted the way she always did to be enough. She was 24 years old. She had been enough for no one so far. But she had genuinely, completely believed that Nathaniel Carter was different. That was the first mistake. It would not be the last one she made that evening, but it would be the one she remembered longest. The engagement had been understood for nearly 2 years, not formalized in writing, not announced to the papers, but understood the way most things were understood in their world, through implication and proximity, and the slow accumulation of evenings spent in the same parlor, the same pew, the same quiet understanding that 2 people were moving toward something. Nathaniel had called on her father. He had spoken of the future. He had placed that ring on her finger on a cold November afternoon in the Whitmore parlor, while her mother wept happy tears from the doorway, and her father shook his hand with the kind of relief that only a man with a modest estate and a beautiful unmarried daughter truly understood. Elizabeth had pressed that ring to her lips that night in her room. She wasn't a foolish woman. She knew the arrangement carried practical weight on both sides. But she also knew she had felt it that Nathaniel looked at her differently than he looked at other women. That when he laughed at something she said, it reached his eyes. That there had been moments, quiet ones, that felt like the real thing. She had held on to those moments. She should have counted the silences instead, because there had been more silences than moments. More canceled visits. More notes sent in apology. More excuses about business, about the expansion of the Carter holdings north of the river, about meetings in Richmond she was never told the substance of. She had made herself small to accommodate those silences. She had told herself that was what a sensible woman did. She had told herself patience was not weakness. She walked into Carter Hall that evening still believing that. She walked out of it something else entirely. The room was full when they arrived. That was the first thing that struck her. Not the heat. Not the music, not the smell of too many candles in a space too warm to hold them. It was the fullness of the room, not a casual gathering. Every significant family in 3 counties seemed to be present. The Fairfaxes, near the far window. Judge Holloway, with his wife and eldest daughter. The Mercer brothers, who owned the 2 largest mills in the county. Senator Aldrich, who had ridden down from Richmond and was holding court near the fireplace, with the particular self-satisfaction of a man who believed his presence anywhere constituted an event. Elizabeth's mother took her arm. "So many people," her mother murmured, and there was something in her voice, not pleasure, not nerves exactly, but a kind of cautious wonder. He must have wanted this evening to mean something. He did, Elizabeth said. She believed it. Even then she believed it. She found Nathaniel across the room within minutes of arriving. He was always easy to find in a crowd, tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who took up space without apologizing for it. He wore dark wool well cut. His dark hair was combed back. He looked exactly as he always looked, composed, certain at ease, in a way that Elizabeth had once admired, and now in the strange clarity of hindsight, she would recognize as the ease of a man who had already made his decision and was simply waiting for the moment to deliver it. He looked at her when she entered. Something passed across his face. She couldn't read it. Later she would understand it had been relief, the relief of a man who had been dreading a conversation and could see it was almost over. In the moment she smiled at him. He did not smile back. He came to her side after 20 minutes. Not immediately. Not with the kind of urgency a man showed when he was glad to see the woman he intended to marry. He finished his conversation with Judge Holloway first. He accepted a glass of something from a passing servant. He crossed the room at his own pace, and Elizabeth stood beside her mother and watched him come, and told herself the tightness in her chest was just the heat. "Miss Whitmore." He took her gloved hand. The greeting was correct. Nothing in it was wrong. Nothing in it was warm. "Mr. Carter." She kept her voice even. "You've gathered quite a crowd this evening." "There is something I wanted the county to witness," he said. His eyes moved briefly to her mother, then back to Elizabeth. "If you'll allow me a moment." Her mother stepped away. She thought he was going to propose formally. Elizabeth could see it on his face, that bright, hopeful look women wore when they believed everything was finally about to be made right. Elizabeth felt something different, something colder. "Is everything all right?" she asked quietly. "That depends," Nathaniel said, "on how one defines all right." The music had been playing softly, someone at the pianoforte light, and unhurried. Elizabeth noticed that it had stopped. She noticed with the heightened attention of someone whose body has understood danger before her mind has caught up that the room had shifted slightly, that conversations had begun to pause, that people had begun in the subtle sideways manner of a society that prided itself on discretion to turn. They knew. Some of them at least already knew. "Nathaniel." Her voice was very quiet. "Whatever you need to say to me, say it to me. Not here." He looked at her for a long moment. She saw it then, not cruelty, not exactly, but something worse. Calculation. The look of a man who had weighed her and found her wanting in a specific, practical, unfixable way. "I'm afraid," he said, raising his voice, just enough to carry, "that this concerns everyone present." The room went fully quiet. It happened the way silence happened in a crowd, not all at once, but in a wave, each small conversation dying, as the next one noticed and stopped. Elizabeth heard it move across the room. She heard her own heartbeat. She heard somewhere behind her, her mother draw a sharp breath. Nathaniel stepped back from her. Not dramatically. Just enough to make clear that there was now space between them. That he was not standing with her. That he was standing apart from her, and the difference was not accidental. He addressed the room. "I have asked you all here this evening," he said, "because I believe in conducting my affairs with honesty and with the full knowledge of those whose opinion I value." Elizabeth did not move. She would think about that later, about why she didn't move, why she didn't speak, why she stood still and let him continue. She thought it was shock in the moment, but she understood later that it was something older and deeper than shock. It was the muscle memory of a woman who had spent her entire life being taught that her first obligation in any room was composure. That making a scene was the one unforgivable sin. That whatever happened to her she owed everyone around her the courtesy of not making them uncomfortable with her response to it. She had been trained for that moment without ever knowing it. "I have long valued the Whitmore family," Nathaniel continued. His voice was steady, practiced. He had rehearsed this. "Miss Elizabeth Whitmore is a woman of considerable virtue and intelligence. It is with the greatest respect that I must regrettably conclude that an alliance between our families does not serve the future I intend to build." He reached into his breast pocket. He produced the ring. He held it out to her on his palm. "I cannot," he said, and his voice carried every inch of that vast heat-soaked room, "build my future upon a small forgotten estate." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Elizabeth had ever heard. She looked at the ring. She looked at his face. She looked at the room full of people watching her, all those careful, contained, well-dressed faces, arranged in the particular expression of people witnessing something painful and being grateful it was not happening to them. Her mother had pressed a handkerchief to her mouth. Her father, her poor, decent, mild-mannered father, who had shaken this man's hand in their parlor, and believed it meant something, stood very still near the doorway, and the color had left his face entirely. Elizabeth looked at Nathaniel Carter. She thought about crying. She understood that was what was expected. The room was waiting for it. He was waiting for it, she suspected, in some part of himself, the part that needed her to collapse, so he could feel magnanimous in his cruelty, so he could tell himself later that she had recovered, that she had found someone suitable, that it had all worked out for everyone. She didn't cry. She pulled off her glove. Slowly. One finger at a time. She folded it. She set it on the small table nearest to her. She reached out and took the ring from his palm, not as if receiving it back, but as if retrieving something that had never truly belonged to him, to return. She set that on the table beside the glove. Then she looked up at him. "Then I hope, Mr. Carter," she said, and her voice was clear and quiet, and reached every corner of that silent room, "that your future proves worth the price you paid for it." She turned. She walked to her father. She took his arm. "Mama," she said quietly, "I'd like to go home." No one stopped them. The room parted. Of course it did. Society always parted for a clean exit. What it did not do was follow them out. What it did not do was come after her in the carriage drive to press her hand and tell her the man was a fool. What it did was stand there in that candlelit room and wait until the Whitmore carriage was out of the gate, and then it began to talk. Elizabeth sat in the carriage between her parents and listened to the night sounds outside, and felt something in her chest that she could not immediately name. Not grief. Not yet. Grief would come later at 3 a.m. when she sat alone in her room and allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had just happened, what had just been done to her in front of everyone who mattered in their county. What she had trusted and what had been handed back to her on a man's open palm in front of a room full of witnesses. What she felt in the carriage was something quieter and stranger than grief. She felt clear. "Lizzie." Her father's voice was thick. "I'm so sorry." "Don't be," she said. "He had no right." "No," she agreed. "He didn't." Her mother was weeping silently against the carriage wall. Elizabeth reached over and took her hand. "Mama, it's all right." "It is not all right," her mother said, her voice muffled by her handkerchief. "We'll never the invitations, the—" "Hush." Elizabeth squeezed her hand. "We'll manage." She looked out at the dark road. She thought about his face, that composed, practiced, certain face. She thought about the way he had held out the ring, not with guilt, not with genuine regret, but with the slightly performative sorrow of a man delivering bad news he had made peace with weeks ago. She thought, he has already decided what happens next for both of us. He has already written the end of this story. And something in her, something she had never quite had occasion to notice before, said very quietly, "No, he hasn't." The weeks that followed were brutal in their specificity. It was not one large blow. It was 100 small ones. The first was the Harrington dinner. She had been invited for months. The invitation was rescinded 3 days after Carter Hall, not with explanation, not with apology. Just a brief pained note from Mrs. Harrington expressing regret that the date had become inconvenient. Elizabeth read the note twice, set it on her desk, and went out to help her father check the tobacco. The second was the Sunday service. She had attended the same church for her entire life. The same pew. The same neighbors. The Sunday after Carter Hall, she sat in that pew and felt the precise temperature of carefully maintained courtesy. Hands, shaken faces, civil. Not one person who met her eyes for more than a second before finding somewhere else to look. The world had decided she was unfortunate, and unfortunate women made people uncomfortable, and uncomfortable people found ways to be very busy. The third was Margaret Ellis. Margaret Ellis did not avoid her. Margaret Ellis was 63 years old, twice widowed, and possessed of the particular freedom that belongs to wealthy women of advanced age who have survived enough to stop caring what anyone thinks. She ran a prosperous farm north of a town, Not a plantation, not a great estate, but a working, profitable operation that she had managed alone for 11 years since her second husband died and left her the whole of it, debts included. She had been at Carter Hall that evening. She came to call on Elizabeth 4 days later. Elizabeth's mother received her in the front parlor with the anxious graciousness of a woman who could not afford to turn away any visitor who still chose to come. Margaret Ellis did not waste time. "Your mother can stay," she said, settling herself into the good chair by the window. "Or she can go get us some tea. Either way, I intend to speak plainly." Elizabeth's mother went for tea. Margaret looked at Elizabeth for a long moment. Not with pity, with assessment. The way a woman who had run a farm for 11 years looked at a tool she was considering whether or not it was worth sharpening. "You didn't cry," Margaret said. "No. Good. Crying would have been a waste of time." She folded her hands in her lap. "I've been watching that Carter boy for 3 years. Nathaniel. His father was a sensible man, knew his limits, worked within them. Nathaniel never learned that particular lesson." Elizabeth said nothing. She had found in the past 4 days that she had very little appetite for conversation. "He's overextended himself," Margaret continued. "Significantly. He bought the Dalton acreage last spring. You know, that land north of the river, 200 acres, paid more than it's worth. Mortgaged the south field to do it." She tilted her head. "I'm telling you this because I think you're going to need to know it." "Why would I need to know the state of his finances, Mrs. Ellis?" "Because," Margaret said, "you're about to spend the next year being treated like a woman who has lost everything. And if that's all you are, a woman who has lost everything, then he wins. He stood up in front of all of Virginia society and declared you insufficient, and the story ends there." She paused. "Unless you have a different ending in mind." Elizabeth looked at her. For the first time in 4 days, she felt something shift. "I'm listening," she said. Thomas Reed was 38, a lawyer of moderate ambition and immoderate competence, who had handled the Whitmore family's land affairs for 6 years, and who received Elizabeth in his small office on the main street of town, with the careful, pained courtesy of a man who had heard what happened and did not know what to say about it. She saved him the trouble of figuring it out. "I don't want to talk about it," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk. "I want to understand something. Land contracts. Bank loans against property. What happens when a man has mortgaged one parcel to buy another?" Reed blinked. "Miss Whitmore. Specifically," she continued, "I want to understand what his obligations are, what the bank can claim. What happens if his expansion project fails to produce the returns he's promised his investors?" Reed was quiet for a moment. "This is about Carter," he said. "Everything in this county is about Carter," she said. "Yes, it is." He studied her for a long moment. She held his gaze and waited. She had gotten good in the past weeks at waiting. "All right," he said finally, and reached for his ledger. "Let's start from the beginning." She went back to Thomas Reed's office 4 more times in the following 3 weeks. She learned things she had not known how to know before. She learned that Nathaniel Carter's expansion, the great northward reach of the Carter holdings, the thing he had cited as his reason for needing a wealthier alliance, was financed almost entirely on credit. The Dalton acreage, the new tobacco warehouse he was building along the river, the equipment he had ordered from a manufacturer in Philadelphia. All of it purchased against the future productivity of land that had not yet been planted, and a tobacco market that was, Reed told her carefully, not behaving with the predictability Nathaniel had counted on. She learned that the Haverford family, whose daughter Catherine Haverford had become a fixture at Nathaniel's side within 6 weeks of the Carter Hall evening, had invested significantly in Nathaniel's expansion project. That the promised marriage between Nathaniel and Catherine Haverford was not in fact love or ambition or even simple preference. It was a financial transaction dressed in good clothes. Catherine Haverford's dowry would shore up the Carter debt. In exchange, the Haverfords would become partners in a Virginia enterprise they believed would make them very rich. She learned that Nathaniel had not shared with the Haverfords the full extent of what he owed or the full uncertainty of the market he was betting everything on. She sat with that knowledge for 2 weeks. She did not decide what to do with it quickly. She was not impulsive. She had never been impulsive. She turned it over in her mind the way her father turned soil, carefully looking at what was under the surface, understanding what could grow there and what couldn't. She talked to Margaret Ellis. If someone wanted to make sure the Haverfords had complete information, Elizabeth said one afternoon, seated in Margaret's clean spare parlor while summer rain came down outside. How would a woman do that without appearing to act out of spite? Margaret considered this. The Haverfords have the lawyer, she said. A man named Giles. He's thorough. If someone were to happen to share documents with him, land records, bank correspondence, the sort of thing that's public record, if you know where to look, he would ask the right questions. And if those questions led him to look more carefully at what Carter has actually promised them, then, Margaret said with the mild satisfaction of a woman watching justice arrange itself, the Haverfords would make their own decision. Elizabeth nodded. She went home. She spent 3 evenings writing letters. Careful letters. Factual letters. Letters that contained nothing she could not support with public record or verified account. Letters that asked no one to believe anything except what the numbers plainly laid out already said. She sent them. And then she waited. She did not wait idly. While she waited, she worked. She had always helped her father with the estate accounts, not because he was incapable, but because she was better at it than he was, and he was honest enough to admit it. Now she pushed further. She read every land contract they held. She identified 2 parcels that were underproducing and traced the reason: poor drainage on the east field, a boundary dispute with a neighbor that had been left to fester for 6 years. She solved the drainage with a conversation and 2 hired men. She solved the boundary dispute by writing out herself, measuring the line against the original deed, and presenting her findings to the neighbor with the quiet, complete confidence of a woman who had done her arithmetic and knew she was right. The neighbor, to his credit, acknowledged it. Her father watched all of this with an expression she couldn't quite read. One evening over supper he said, "You know, your grandfather always said the Whitmore land would be run properly one day." He just assumed he meant by a son. Elizabeth looked up at him. He was smiling. Not broadly, just enough. "I reckon grandfather had some blind spots," she said. "Most men do," he agreed. She went back to her accounting. The first sign that something was happening came from Thomas Reed. He came to call, not at her office, at her home on a Tuesday afternoon in late August. His face was careful in the way it got when he had information he wasn't sure how to present. "The Haverford lawyer," he said when her mother had been persuaded to leave them in the parlor. "Giles, he's been to the county records office 3 times in the past 2 weeks. Elizabeth set down her pen. "And he's pulled the Carter land filings, the mortgage documents, the bank correspondence regarding the tobacco warehouse." Reed paused. "The Haverfords have asked to postpone the wedding announcement indefinitely." Elizabeth was quiet for a moment. "Has Nathaniel been told?" "He has." Reed's voice was very careful. "He's apparently told a number of people that the postponement is mutual, that both families agreed." Another pause. "That is not, as I understand it, entirely accurate." Elizabeth nodded. She felt something, not triumph, not exactly. Something steadier than that. Something that felt like the world correcting itself slowly in the direction of the truth. "Thank you, Thomas," she said. He stood to leave, then paused at the door. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "For what it's worth." He seemed to search for words. "You handled it well. All of it." "I haven't done anything," she said. "No," he agreed. "That's rather the point, isn't it?" She was in the east field with her father when she heard the carriage. She did not look up immediately. She was in the middle of something, an argument, gentle but firm, about which portion of the field to plant first in spring, and she wanted to finish her point before she lost the thread of it. She heard the carriage stop. She heard the particular silence that followed. The sound of a man getting down. The particular quality of quiet that meant someone was standing and not moving. She looked up. Nathaniel Carter was standing at the edge of the field. He was not dressed as she was accustomed to seeing him. Not the careful dark wool of Carter Hall, not the easy elegance of a man at home in his position. He looked tired. He looked, she thought, reduced, not in the obvious external way, but in the way a man looked when the certainty had gone out of him, and he hadn't yet figured out what to replace it with. Her father had gone very still beside her. "William," Nathaniel said, "if I might speak with your daughter." Her father looked at her. Elizabeth handed him the notebook she'd been holding. "5 minutes," she said to Nathaniel. "Right here." He came to her. He did not look at her father, who remained exactly where he was 10 feet away, ostensibly examining the notebook. "Elizabeth," Nathaniel said. She waited. "The Haverfords have withdrawn," he said. "You know that." "I've heard. The bank has called in the note on the south field." His voice was level. She could hear what it cost him to keep it that way. "The tobacco warehouse will not be finished before winter. The investors are concerns." "I imagine there are," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "Was this you?" he asked. She considered her answer. "I shared public documents with a lawyer," she said. "The same documents anyone could have found. I asked no one to believe anything except what the numbers said." "Elizabeth." "You stood up in front of every family in this county," she said, "and you told them I was insufficient. You told them my home was beneath you. You did that publicly, Nathaniel, on purpose, because you wanted them to see that you were willing to leave small things behind." His jaw tightened. "I had reasons. I know your reasons," she said. "I've read your contracts. I understand your arithmetic. I know exactly what you needed and why you thought Catherine Haverford's money was the answer." She looked at him steadily. "And I know that you lied to her family about the extent of what you owe. That was not my doing. That was yours." He said nothing. "I didn't ruin you, Nathaniel." Her voice was quiet, completely, entirely quiet. "You made choices. Choices have consequences. That's all." He stood there for a moment. The field was very still around them. Heat sat heavy in the air. "What do you want?" he asked. His voice had gone flat. "Satisfaction, an apology." "No," she said. "I don't want anything from you. That's rather the point." She held his gaze for one more moment. Then she turned back to her father and held out her hand for the notebook. "Now," she said, "about the east field. I think we start with the upper section." Her father handed her the notebook. He did not look at Nathaniel Carter. Neither did she. After a moment, she heard the carriage turn and move away down the road. She did not watch it go. That evening, alone in her room, Elizabeth sat at her writing desk and looked at her hands for a long time. She thought about the girl who had ridden to Carter Hall in a pressed blue gown with her grandmother's earrings, and her heart full of something she had been afraid to name too clearly, in case naming it made it too fragile. She thought about what it had felt like to stand in that room and hear her home called small and forgotten. To hear herself described with regret. To pick up that ring from his palm in front of all those watching eyes. She thought about Margaret Ellis, who had come when everyone else stayed away. She thought about Thomas Reed explaining land contracts across a desk with patient, steady competence. She thought about her father handing her the notebook without a word. She picked up her pen. She opened her account book to a new page. At the top, in her clean, precise hand, she wrote, "Spring Planting Eastfield Revised Plan." Outside, the Virginia summer night pressed warm against the windows, and the land that Nathaniel Carter had called small and forgotten stretched out in every direction, dark and full of possibility, waiting for someone who understood its value to decide what it could become. She dipped her pen. She began to write. The account book was still open on Elizabeth's desk when Margaret Ellis came back. It was a Thursday morning, 9 days after Nathaniel's visit to the East Field, and Margaret did not send a note ahead of time. She never did. She arrived the way she always arrived, directly, without ceremony, as if the possibility that her timing might be inconvenient had simply never occurred to her. Elizabeth heard the carriage from the upper hall and came downstairs, still holding her pen. Margaret was already in the parlor. Elizabeth's mother had offered tea and received a brisk nod in response, and retreated to the kitchen with the relieved expression of a woman who was grateful to have somewhere to be. "Sit down," Margaret said, though it was Elizabeth's house. Elizabeth sat. "I heard he came," Margaret said. "He did." And he asked if it was me. Elizabeth set her pen on the side table. I told him I shared public documents with a lawyer, which is true. Margaret studied her. How did he look? Elizabeth thought about that for a moment. She thought about the tiredness she'd seen in him, the particular specific tiredness of a man whose certainty had been the thing holding him upright, and who was only beginning to understand it was gone. Like a man who built his house on sand, she said, and is standing in the first serious rain. Margaret made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Good description. She folded her hands. The Haverfords have moved their money. Not all of it, but enough. Enough that Nathaniel will have to renegotiate with the bank before December. She paused. He won't get favorable terms. Not now. Word travels. Word about what exactly? About a man who misrepresented his position to a family he was asking for money. Margaret's voice was precise. Not satisfied, Margaret Ellis was too disciplined for satisfaction. Just precise. The Haverfords are not quiet people when they're angry, Elizabeth. Catherine's father has already spoken to Senator Aldrich, and Aldrich, she tilted her head, was at Carter Hall the night it happened. Elizabeth was quiet for a moment. She thought about Senator Aldrich by the fireplace holding his glass, watching Nathaniel perform his careful cruelty with an audience. She thought about what it meant that the same man was now hearing from a wronged investor about the shape of Nathaniel's actual finances. Aldrich will talk, she said. Aldrich is already talking, Margaret said. That's rather the point. Elizabeth picked up her pen again. Not to write, just to have something in her hand. A habit she'd had since childhood, holding something small and solid when she needed to think. I didn't intend for it to move this fast, she said. Truth usually moves faster than people expect, Margaret said. Once it starts, it doesn't ask permission. What Elizabeth had not anticipated was the way people began to look at her differently, not all at once. Nothing in their world happened all at once. But slowly, in the weeks that followed Nathaniel's visit to the East Field, something shifted. Not a restoration. She was clear-eyed enough to know that Virginia society did not simply reverse itself, did not open its doors back up and pretend the closing had never happened. It was subtler than that. It was the difference between being invisible and being noticed. Mrs. Harrington stopped her after Sunday service. Not to rescind any slight, not to apologize for the withdrawn dinner invitation. Just to ask in a careful, neutral voice how her father's East Field was coming along. Elizabeth told her. Mrs. Harrington nodded twice with what appeared to be genuine interest and moved on. It was small. It meant almost nothing. But it was different from being looked through, and Elizabeth filed it away. The second thing that happened was Thomas Reed. He came to the house on a Wednesday evening. Not his usual office hours. Not his usual careful courtesy of announcing himself in advance. He came to the door himself, and when her mother let him in, he asked for Elizabeth specifically, with the focused energy of a man who had something to say, and had been thinking about how to say it for several days. Sit down, Thomas, Elizabeth said when her mother had again retreated. You look like you've been carrying something heavy. I have been, he said. He sat. He put his hands on his knees and looked at her with the directness that she had come to understand was his particular form of respect. There's an opportunity. I don't know if you'll want it, but I think you should hear it. Then tell me. The Caldwell property, he said. You know it. She knew it. Everyone in the county knew it. 40 acres southeast of town, sitting on good soil with a clean water source that 3 different families had been quietly fighting over for 2 years. Old Mr. Caldwell had died in the spring, and his sons. Both of them in Maryland. Neither of them interested in Virginia. Farmland had been trying to settle the estate ever since. They want to sell, Reed said. Quickly, below value. They want the estate closed, and they want the money in hand before winter. Elizabeth looked at him. How far below value? She asked. He told her. She was quiet for a long moment. That's half what the land is worth, she said. A little less than half. He held her gaze. Your father doesn't have the capital, not liquid. But if someone were to approach the Caldwell sons with a credible offer and a credible plan. What kind of plan? A proposal, he said. A serious one, with projected yield drainage improvement costs, timeline to profitability. He paused. The kind of document that tells a man in Maryland who has never farmed a day in his life exactly why he should trust a specific buyer with his father's land. Elizabeth looked at her pen sitting on the side table where she'd put it down. "I've been working on the East Field projections," she said slowly. "I know. You showed me. The same methodology would apply to the Caldwell soil. It has similar drainage issues on the lower section." "I believe it does," Reed said. "Yes." She looked up at him. "You could write the proposal yourself," she said. "Or find another buyer. Why are you bringing this to me?" I was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, thinking. The difference she had learned was that Reed's hesitations were brief and his thinking was thorough. "Because," he said, "you're the best reader of land in this county that I have encountered in 15 years of practice. Because the East Field plan you put together was better than anything I've seen from men with formal training." He paused. "And because I think you've been underestimated so long you've started to believe it yourself. I don't want to watch that continue." Elizabeth looked at him for a long moment. "That's a very frank thing to say, Thomas. You've always responded better to Frank," he said. She picked up her pen. "Give me 3 days," she said. "I'll have a proposal." She wrote it in 2. She worked through the first evening at her desk, while her parents moved through the house around her, her father coming to look over her shoulder once quietly, and then leaving without a word. She worked through the second morning with Margaret Ellis, who had appeared again with no announcement, and apparently infinite patience for agricultural arithmetic, correcting one of Elizabeth's drainage cost estimates with the brisk confidence of someone who had solved the same problem 11 years ago on her own land. "You're too conservative here," Margaret said, tapping the page. "The Hendersons did this kind of rerouting in 1812. It cost them less than half of what you've put down." "I'd rather underestimate profit than overestimate it," Elizabeth said. "You'd rather not look foolish." Margaret gave her a pointed look. "That's different from being careful. Don't let the fear of looking foolish make you look small." Elizabeth looked at the number. She revised it. She sent the proposal to Thomas Reed on Friday morning. He read it and said nothing for a long moment, and then he looked up and said, "I'll write to the Caldwell sons today." The response came back in 10 days. In the meantime, the county went on doing what the county always did: talking, watching, drawing conclusions. Elizabeth was aware of it the way you were aware of weather, not obsessively, not with alarm, just as a fact of the climate she was moving through. She knew Nathaniel had been to Richmond twice. She knew the bank meeting had not gone the way he'd hoped. She knew Catherine Haverford had begun calling on the Mercer family's eldest daughter with a frequency that suggested the Haverfords were already looking at their next option. She did not seek out any of this information. It came to her the way information came to anyone in a small county where people talked through Thomas Reed's careful updates, through Margaret's unsparing observations, through her own mother, who had begun attending church with the re-energized social antenna of a woman who had realized her daughter was no longer simply a cautionary tale. "Mrs. Pruitt asked after you today," her mother reported one Sunday with the restrained excitement of someone who has trained herself not to seem too excited. "After the service, she asked how you were getting on with the East Field." "What did you tell her?" "I told her you'd solved the drainage problem and were planning the spring yield already." Her mother paused. She seemed impressed. "Mrs. Pruitt has never been impressed by me in her life," Elizabeth said. "No." Her mother's voice was careful. "But she is now." Elizabeth thought about that. She thought about it while she worked. She thought about it in the early mornings when she rode out to check the East Field, and stood in the flat, pale light, and looked at the soil, and thought about what it could yield if you understood it properly. She thought about it in the evenings at her desk. She thought about whether it mattered whether the shifting temperature of a county's opinion was something she wanted, something she was working toward, something that meant anything at all. She kept coming back to the same answer: it mattered less than she would have thought. What mattered was the work. What mattered was the proposal sitting in Thomas Reed's letterbox, waiting for word from Maryland. What mattered was the East Field drainage and the spring planting plan and the slow, steady accumulation of a future. She was building herself without anyone's permission on ground that was hers. The county could watch if it wanted to. She had stopped performing for it. The Caldwell sons said yes. Thomas Reed came to the house on a Tuesday afternoon with the letter in hand and a look on his face that was as close to giddy as a careful lawyer ever allowed himself to get. He handed her the letter. She read it standing in the hallway, still holding her riding gloves from the morning. The price was below market. The terms were straightforward. The Caldwell sons wanted a quick close and a clean transfer, and they had found in Elizabeth's proposal something they apparently hadn't expected: a buyer who understood exactly what they were selling and had laid out in plain and specific language why it was worth buying. Her father had come in from outside. He read the letter over her shoulder. He didn't say anything immediately. He put his hand on her shoulder briefly, firmly, and then walked back outside. She watched him go. She understood. "Congratulations," Thomas Reed said. "Thank you," she said, "for bringing it to me." "Thank yourself," he said. "I brought you a door. You opened it." She was at the south fence line of the new Caldwell acreage, her acreage. Now still strange to think of that way, measuring the lower section against her drainage estimates when she heard a horse approaching. She did not look up immediately. She was mid-calculation, and she wanted to finish it. The horse stopped. She heard the rider dismount. "Miss Whitmore?" She looked up. It was James Haverford, not Catherine's father, James, the younger brother. 26 years old, newly arrived from Philadelphia to help manage the family's Virginia interests. She had met him twice briefly at gatherings before Carter Hall. He was dark-haired, quieter than his family's reputation suggested, and he was looking at her now with an expression she couldn't immediately read. She straightened. "Mr. Haverford." He pulled off his hat. It was a small gesture, but he did it with care, the particular deliberateness of a man who was aware of how he might be perceived and was trying to communicate something specific. "I owe you an apology," he said. She waited. "My family, we weren't kind to you after Carter Hall." He looked at the hat in his hands. "We followed everyone else. We withdrew. We should have. It was wrong." "Your family didn't owe me anything," Elizabeth said. "Maybe not, but common decency." He stopped, started again. "I've heard what happened, the full picture now. What Carter told my father about his finances. What he didn't tell him." His jaw tightened briefly. "My father trusted him. My sister almost—" He stopped again. "Well, it doesn't matter now." "It matters," Elizabeth said quietly. "If it taught your family to look more carefully at what a man shows versus what he is." Haverford looked at her. Something in his expression shifted. Not surprise exactly, but a kind of recalibration. "May I ask," he said carefully, "how you knew about the loans, the mortgage on the south field?" "I read," Elizabeth said. "Public records, county filings. It wasn't difficult. It just required someone to be interested enough to look." "Most people weren't interested." "Most people were looking at what he wanted them to see," she said. "I had reason to look elsewhere." I was quiet for a moment. "That land," he said, nodding toward the lower field. "The Caldwell parcel." "Mine," she said. "As of last week." Something moved in his face. Not pity. She had become very good at identifying pity, and this was not it. It was closer to reassessment. The look of a man who had walked in with one idea of who he was meeting and was already revising it. "Thomas Reed said you'd written the proposal yourself," Haverford said. "He shouldn't have told you that." "He's proud of his clients when they deserve it," Haverford said. "I think he reckoned you wouldn't mind." A pause. "My family has some capital we'd been planning to place with Carter. Obviously that's no longer—" He stopped. "I don't want to be forward." "Then don't be," Elizabeth said pleasantly. "Come back when you have a specific proposal, and we'll discuss it specifically." He blinked. Then slowly he smiled. It changed his face, made him look younger and more genuine, and considerably less like a Haverford. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He put his hat back on. "I'll do that." She watched him right away. She stood there for a moment in the warm afternoon. Then she went back to her measurements. Margaret Ellis had a dinner party in September. It was not, she was careful to emphasize, a formal affair. A dinner. 6 people. Her parlor, her table, her rules, which included no discussion of anyone's matrimonial prospects, no mention of the Carter business, and absolutely no one using the phrase, "such a shame about," in reference to anything. Elizabeth came. She sat between Thomas Reed and a woman named Dorothea Crane, who had moved to the county 3 years ago from Connecticut, and who ran a small millinery with an efficiency that the county had spent 3 years finding vaguely threatening, and had now reluctantly decided to respect. Dorothea was 47, direct in the manner of New England, and utterly uninterested in Virginia social hierarchy. "I've been watching you," she said to Elizabeth, about 20 minutes into the meal, with the cheerful bluntness of someone who did not consider this a strange thing to say. "Have you?" Elizabeth said. "I have, since Carter Hall." She took a sip of her wine. "You handled it better than most would have." "I had good help. You had Margaret and Reed," Dorothea said. "But the help only works if the person taking it knows what to do with it." She tilted her head. "What are you planning to do with the Caldwell land long term?" Elizabeth looked at her. "Why? Because I've been looking for a specific kind of landowner for 2 years, Dorothea said. "Someone with good soil and good sense, and no particular attachment to doing things the way they've always been done." She paused. "I import wool from Connecticut. I have a supplier, but processing costs me more than it should because I'm doing it all myself." She looked at Elizabeth steadily. "If someone had the right pasture acreage and an interest in running a small operation—" "Dorothea," Margaret said from the head of the table, "you said no business at dinner." "I said no discussing matrimonial prospects," Dorothea said serenely. "This is commerce." Margaret made a gesture that conveyed both exasperation and fundamental agreement. Elizabeth looked at her plate for a moment. She thought about the lower section of the Caldwell land. She thought about the water source. She thought about the wool market, which she had read about in passing and set aside because it hadn't seemed relevant. It was relevant now. "Come see the land before you decide anything," Elizabeth said. "But I'm listening." She was listening to a great many things by that point. She listened when Margaret talked about her own farm, the decisions she'd made, the ones she'd gotten wrong, and how she'd corrected them, the particular arithmetic of running land without a husband, and the specific freedom that came with it. She listened when Thomas Reed explained the mechanics of a lease agreement versus an ownership contract, and what each meant for liability and return. She listened when her father talked about the tobacco market and the weather patterns, and which neighbors could be trusted to maintain a fence line and which could not. She was absorbing everything, and she was doing it deliberately, with the focused attention of someone who understood that the knowledge she was building was the thing that could not be taken from her. Nathaniel Carter could call her small and forgotten. He could not call her stupid. He could not call her unprepared. He could not, she was increasingly certain, call her anything at all, because she intended to be so far ahead of him by the time anyone thought to compare them, that the comparison would be absurd. She did not think about Nathaniel often. She was surprised by this. She had expected to think about him constantly, to replay Carter Hall, to revisit every conversation they'd had in the light of what she now knew about him, to feel the shape of what he had done pressing against her thoughts at all hours. Instead, she found he occupied less and less of her mind as the months moved on. Not because she had forgiven him, she was honest with herself about that. Forgiveness was a different thing from indifference, and she was not quite at either. But because the work she was doing was more interesting than he was. Because the land was more interesting. Because Dorothea Crane's wool proposal was more interesting. Because James Haverford's quiet, careful reappearance at the edge of her attention was more interesting. He came back as promised with a specific proposal. She received him in the Whitmore parlor, her mother present this time, seated with embroidery. She was manifestly not paying attention to and listened to what he had to say. He wanted to invest in the Caldwell land. Not all of it. Not as a partner in the farming operation, but as a minor investor in what he called carefully the long-term development of the property. He had done his own research, she could tell. The proposal was specific, grounded, not the speculative language of a man throwing money at an idea. He had consulted someone. She suspected it was Reed. She asked him 3 questions. His answers were precise and honest, including one instance where he admitted he didn't know and would need to find out. She liked that. "I'll think about it," she said. "That's all I ask," he said. He stood to leave. At the door he paused. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "For what it's worth." He stopped. Started again. What Carter did was wrong, not just the manner of it, the whole of it. A man who throws away something valuable because he can't see its worth. He stopped again, as if aware he'd gone further than he intended. Anyway, Elizabeth agreed. He left. Her mother put down her embroidery and looked at Elizabeth with an expression that contained the entirety of a mother's hope and a mother's caution wrapped together. "He's nothing like Carter," her mother said. "No," Elizabeth agreed. "He's not. He has an honest face." "Honest faces are a start," Elizabeth said. "They're not a guarantee." Her mother looked at her for a long moment. "You've changed," she said. Not with sadness. Just with the particular wondering recognition of a woman watching her child become someone she hadn't expected and is not sure yet whether to worry about. Elizabeth picked up her pen. "I've been paying attention," she said. "That's all." In October, a letter arrived from Richmond. It was addressed to her father, but her father brought it to Elizabeth without opening it, which was its own kind of statement. She opened it at the kitchen table, while her mother pretended to arrange things on the shelf behind her. It was from Senator Aldrich's office. Not from Aldrich himself, from his secretary, which was how Aldrich communicated anything he didn't want formally attributed to him. The letter inquired in the careful language of political courtesy whether the Whitmore family might have interest in a formal land survey of the county's eastern parcels, to be conducted under the auspices of the state, and whether Miss Elizabeth Whitmore, her name specifically, might be available to consult on the process, given her evident expertise in local land records and agricultural yield analysis. Her mother had stopped pretending to arrange things. Her father was looking at her. Elizabeth read the letter twice. She set it on the table. "Aldrich was at Carter Hall," she said. "He was," her father said. "He watched the whole thing." "He did. And now he wants to put my name on a state survey." "It appears so," her father said. His voice was very careful. But there was something in it, the same something she had heard when he said grandfather had blind spots. Something that was trying very hard to be measured and not quite succeeding. Elizabeth looked at the letter. She thought about Nathaniel standing at Carter Hall with the ring on his palm, telling the county she was not enough. She thought about what Aldrich had seen that night. She thought about what he was seeing now. She thought the county is revising its story about me. Not because I asked it to, because I gave it something more accurate to work with. "Tell me something," she said to her father. "If grandfather had left this land to you when you were 24, what would you have done with it?" He thought about it honestly. That was one of the things she loved about him. He always answered honestly, even when the honest answer was uncomfortable. "I would have run it the way he ran it," he said. "The same crops, the same methods. I would have been steady and careful, and probably unremarkable." She nodded. "I won't be unremarkable," she said. "No," he agreed. "You won't." She picked up her pen and began her reply to Senator Aldrich's office. Outside, the October fields were golden and wide, and somewhere in Richmond, the shape of what she was building was becoming visible to people she hadn't even tried to reach. And somewhere in Virginia, in a house where the south field was mortgaged and the tobacco warehouse sat half-finished against the coming winter. Nathaniel Carter was learning too late the cost of looking at something true and calling it insufficient. Elizabeth wrote. She did not think about him at all. The letter to Senator Aldrich's office took Elizabeth 40 minutes to write. Not because she didn't know what to say. She knew exactly what to say. It took 40 minutes because she wrote it 3 times. The first too eager, the second too cold, the third exactly right. Measured. Professional. The language of a woman who understood that how you entered a room mattered as much as what you did once you were inside it. She gave it to Thomas Reed to review before she sent it. He read it standing in his office doorway and said nothing for a long moment. "You wrote this yourself," he said. "Of course I did." "No qualifications, No apology for your inexperience. He looked up. Good. Don't add any. She hadn't planned to. She took the letter back, sealed it, and posted it herself on the way home. The reply came 12 days later. Aldrich's secretary, a man named Pruitt, who was the son of Mrs. Pruitt from church, and had clearly inherited none of his mother's social caution, wrote back with the efficiency of someone who had been told to make a thing happen and intended to make it happen. The survey would begin in March, when the ground thawed. Elizabeth's role would be consultant on Eastern parcel records and yield analysis. She would be compensated. The figure named was modest, but it was real and it was hers. She folded the letter and set it in the cedar box on her desk, where she kept the things that mattered. Then she went back to work. November arrived with the particular severity that Virginia reserved for the months it wanted you to take seriously. Cold that came in fast, the kind that made the old farmhouse settle and groan at night, and made Elizabeth wrap her hands around her coffee cup in the mornings and stay there an extra moment before she made herself move. She was drafting the wool operation proposal for Dorothea Crane when Margaret Ellis arrived on a Wednesday morning with the expression Elizabeth had come to recognize as her version of urgent. Margaret did not do urgent the way other people did. She didn't rush or flutter. She simply became more still, more precise. And when she spoke, she chose every word as if she had already decided which ones she was willing to waste. "Sit down," Margaret said, which was again not a question. Elizabeth sat. "What happened?" "Carter went to the bank last week," Margaret said. "Not the county bank, Richmond, the main branch." She settled into the chair. "He was there for 4 hours." "How do you know this?" "Because Aldrich has a brother-in-law who manages the Richmond branch," Margaret said with the calm of a woman who had spent 60 years cultivating exactly the right relationships. "And Aldrich is not fond of men who embarrass investors in his social circle." Elizabeth looked at her. "What did the bank say?" "They gave him terms," Margaret said. "But not the terms he wanted. They'll extend the mortgage on the Southfield through next spring, but they want a second signatory on the tobacco warehouse loan, someone who can vouch for the project's viability." She paused. "He's been asking around. No one has said yes yet." Elizabeth was quiet. She thought about that. A second signatory. A man willing to put his name next to Nathaniel Carter's on a loan document in November of 1866, when every significant family in 3 counties had heard some version of what he'd done to the Haverfords. "He won't find one easily," she said. "He won't find one at all," Margaret said. "Not anyone worth having." She leaned forward slightly. "But that's not what I came to tell you. The bank meeting is one thing. What I came to tell you is about the warehouse workers." Elizabeth looked up. "He laid off 4 of them last month," Margaret said. Quietly, said it was seasonal. But they weren't seasonal workers. 2 of them had been with his family for 12 years. She held Elizabeth's gaze. "One of them is John Sayers." Elizabeth set down her pen. John Sayers was 53 years old, had worked the Carter land since before Nathaniel was born, and had a wife and 3 children still at home. She had known him peripherally her whole life, not well, not closely, but the way you knew everyone in a small county where everyone's circumstances were visible to everyone else. "Is he looking for work?" she asked. "He is," Margaret said. "And he's not the only one." Elizabeth thought about the Caldwell land. The lower section still partly unworked. The drainage project she'd been planning for spring. The wool operation with Dorothea that was going to need hands if it was going to be anything more than a proposal on paper. "Send him to me," she said. Margaret's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes did. "I'll do that," she said. John Sayers came on a Friday afternoon hat in hand, with the careful dignity of a man who had worked hard his whole life and found himself through no fault of his own in the position of needing to ask for something. He stood in the Whitmore yard and looked at Elizabeth with the particular caution of someone who wasn't sure what to make of her, a young woman unmarried talking to him about land and drainage and a spring operation schedule as if she'd been doing it for 20 years. She showed him the Caldwell field. She walked him through what she was planning. She asked him questions about how Carter had managed his drainage issues, what had worked and what hadn't, what the soil in this part of the county needed and what it couldn't tolerate. He answered carefully at first, then less carefully, then with the warming confidence of a man who knows something and is being asked to share it by someone who actually wants to know. "Miss Whitmore," he said when they'd been walking for an hour, "if you don't mind my asking, you're planning to run all of this yourself?" "With good help," she said. "Yes." He looked at the lower field. He looked at the drainage line she'd sketched in her notebook. He looked back at her. "Carter never would have done it this way," he said. "He'd have hired someone to tell him what to do and argued with them half the time." "I know," Elizabeth said. Sayers was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once, the nod of a man making a decision. "All right." "Right," he said. "When do I start?" The thing about truth, Elizabeth had learned, was that it didn't always arrive with drama. Sometimes it arrived in the form of a man named Sayers telling her over the course of 2 weeks of working together small and specific things about the Carter operation that she had not known and had not asked for, but that assembled themselves piece by piece into a picture she couldn't unsee. It wasn't deliberate. Sayers wasn't a gossip. He was the opposite. A man who held his words the way he held tools, only picking up what he needed for the job. But when you worked alongside someone, you talked. And when you talked, things came out. He told her not as revelation, but as plain observation, that the tobacco warehouse Nathaniel was building had a structural problem. The foundation on the riverside had been poured wrong. He'd seen it himself, had said something to the site foreman, had been told it wasn't his concern. He told her the Carter Southfield, the one mortgaged to the bank, had been over-harvested 2 years running. Nathaniel had pushed for yield numbers that looked good on paper and had taken more from the soil than it could sustain. The field that had been pledged as security was worth significantly less than Nathaniel had represented. He told her this matter-of-factly, the way a man talked about weather. Elizabeth wrote it down. Not to use. Not yet. She wasn't sure yet what using it would mean, or whether it needed to be used at all. She filed it in the same cedar box where she kept the Aldrich letter and the Caldwell deed and all the other things she had gathered without quite knowing what the whole of them would eventually amount to. The picture was becoming clearer. She just wasn't sure who else needed to see it yet. The answer came in December, and it came from the direction she least expected. Catherine Haverford came to call. Not James. Catherine. The woman Nathaniel had chosen over Elizabeth, who had been the instrument of the whole of the previous year's humiliation, without ever quite being its author. Catherine Haverford was 22 years old, pretty in a bright and somewhat effortful way, and had spent the better part of the year being told she'd had a lucky escape, and responding to this with the uncertain smile of someone who wasn't sure whether to believe it. Elizabeth, her mother made tea, and then apparently thought better of staying, which was, Elizabeth reflected, the most diplomatically sophisticated thing her mother had done all year. The two women sat across from each other. Catherine looked at her hands. She looked at the tea. She looked at the window. She looked finally at Elizabeth. "I owe you an apology," she said. "I don't know if you think so, but I do." Elizabeth said nothing. "I didn't know what he'd planned that night," Catherine said. Her voice was careful, practiced as if she'd rehearsed this. "Carter Hall. I didn't know he intended to the way he did it. The ring in front of everyone." She stopped. "My father had spoken to his father about a possible arrangement. I knew that. But I didn't know he would. I didn't think—" "Did you care?" Elizabeth asked. Catherine stopped. "Did you care?" Elizabeth said again, not unkindly. "What it cost me, at the time." A long pause. "No," Catherine said quietly. "I'm ashamed of that. But no. I was thinking about myself." She looked up. "I think most of us were." Elizabeth appreciated the honesty. It cost the girl something she could see it on her face. "What do you want, Miss Haverford?" Elizabeth asked. "I want to tell you something," Catherine said. "Something I don't think you know. And I want to tell you because—" She stopped. "Because I've watched what you've done this year, and I think you deserve to know it, and I think if someone had told me earlier things might have been—" She stopped again. "Anyway." Elizabeth was very still. "Tell me," she said. Catherine looked at the window. Nathaniel approached my father in March, she said. Before Carter Hall. Before he... She swallowed. He didn't come to my father because he loved me. I think I knew that. I think my father knew it too, and didn't want to admit it. He came because my father had money, and because my grandfather left me a specific inheritance, a land trust in the western counties, and Nathaniel wanted access to that trust. She paused. My grandfather's trust is tied to marriage. If I marry, my husband becomes co-trustee. The land alone is worth 3 times what Nathaniel owes the bank. Elizabeth looked at her. He wasn't marrying you, Elizabeth said slowly. He was acquiring your grandfather's trust. Yes. Catherine's voice was flat. And my father almost let him. Because Nathaniel was charming, and because his family name was old, and because my father wanted... She stopped. Well, it doesn't matter what my father wanted. How did you find out? Elizabeth asked. James, Catherine said. My brother, he's thorough. When the Haverfords got your lawyer's letter, Giles and James started pulling records. He found correspondence. Her jaw tightened. A letter Nathaniel had written to his own lawyer, laying out the financial advantage of the arrangement. She looked at Elizabeth steadily. He laid it out like a ledger entry. My grandfather's trust, the acreage, the value at market. She swallowed. My name wasn't in the letter at all, just the trust, just the land. Elizabeth sat with that for a moment. She thought about Nathaniel at Carter Hall, telling the county she was not enough. She thought about the ring on his palm. She thought about the way he'd looked at her, not with cruelty, but with that calm, calculating assessment, as if she were a line item he'd decided to cut. He had looked at Catherine Haverford the same way. He had just been smarter about hiding it. How was going to do to you? Elizabeth said. Eventually what he did to me. Once he had what he needed. I know, Catherine said. I know that now. Elizabeth looked at her. You came here, Elizabeth said, to give me that letter. Catherine reached into her coat. She set a folded document on the table between them. James made a copy, she said, before Giles sent everything back. She looked at it. I don't know what you'll do with it. Maybe nothing. Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe he's already ruined enough without... She stopped. But I thought you should have it, because he chose to do what he did to you in front of everyone, and you handled it better than anyone had a right to expect, and... Her voice wavered slightly. And I think it's yours. I think you earned it. Elizabeth looked at the letter. She picked it up. She read it. It was worse than she'd expected, and exactly as bad as the picture in her cedar box had suggested it might be. Nathaniel's handwriting addressed to his personal lawyer, laying out with neat precision the financial mechanics of the Haverford arrangement, the grandfather's trust, the acreage value, the way co-trusteeship would allow him to leverage the land against his existing debts. There was a line near the bottom that read, "The girl herself is manageable." The attachment of the trust to the marriage condition is the primary concern. The girl herself is manageable. Elizabeth set the letter down. She was quiet for a moment. Thank you, she said to Catherine Haverford. Her voice was even. She was proud of that. This took courage. Catherine shook her head. It took too long, she said. That's the honest version. She stood. She smoothed her coat. She looked at Elizabeth with an expression that was not quite admiration and not quite guilt, but something that contained elements of both. You're going to be all right, aren't you? Catherine said. It wasn't quite a question. Yes, Elizabeth said. Catherine nodded. She left. Elizabeth sat in the parlor alone for a long time. She held the letter and thought about it. Not about what to do with it, not immediately, but about what it revealed. About the shape of a man she had thought she understood, and had it turned out only seen the surface of. She had known Nathaniel was calculating. She had known the Carter Hall performance was designed. But this was something else. This was the document beneath the document, the version of his thinking he'd never intended anyone outside his own study to see. The girl herself is manageable. She thought about what that phrase would have meant for Catherine Haverford's life. The quiet management of a woman who had been acquired for her grandfather's land trust. The slow erosion of a life under the authority of a man who had never seen the person, only the asset. She thought I was lucky. Not in the way the county meant lucky, not lucky to be rid of him, not lucky in the shallow sense. Lucky that he had discarded her publicly and completely, that he had done it fast and clean, that she had picked up the ring from his palm and walked out and never had to find this out the slow way. Lucky that she had been deemed insufficient before she was trapped. She put the letter in the cedar box. Then she went and found Thomas Reed. Read the letter at his desk with the careful stillness of a lawyer who has learned never to let his expression move faster than his thinking. When he finished, he set it down. He looked at her. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "Catherine Haverford." He absorbed that. Voluntarily. "Completely," Elizabeth said. "James made the copy. She brought it." Reed was quiet for a moment. He pressed 2 fingers against his mouth, which was what he did when he was working through something complex, and wanted to make sure he got to the end of it before he opened the conversation back up. "This document," he said finally, "establishes that Nathaniel Carter misrepresented the nature of his intentions to the Haverford family. Specifically that he was pursuing the marriage arrangement for financial and legal access to the Haverford Trust, while presenting it as a personal alliance." He looked at her. "Combined with what we already have, the overvalued Southfield, the warehouse foundation problem, the bank representations, this gives a very complete picture." "A complete picture of what?" Elizabeth asked. "Of a man," Reed said carefully, "who has been conducting his affairs based on systematic misrepresentation of both his financial position and his intentions." He paused. "The bank in Richmond should know about the warehouse foundation. The investors who are still in the tobacco project should know about the Southfield's actual condition." Another pause. "Senator Aldrich's office might be very interested in the overall pattern, given that one of his primary roles is oversight of land and commercial contracts in this district." Elizabeth looked at him. "I don't want to destroy him," she said. Reed looked back at her steadily. "That's not what I'm describing." "Then what are you describing?" "I'm describing," he said, "what happens when the relevant parties have accurate information. What they do with it is their business." He held her gaze. "You didn't create any of this, Elizabeth. The foundation was poured wrong before you ever read a land contract. The Southfield was overworked before you ever sat in my office. He wrote that letter to his lawyer before he ever stood up at Carter Hall." He paused. "All you've done is look at what was already there." She thought about what Margaret had said. Truth usually moves faster than people expect. Once it starts, it doesn't ask permission. "If I bring this to Aldrich," she said, "all of it, what happens?" "I don't know," Reed said honestly. "Some of it's legal, some of it's commercial, some of it is simply reputational." He folded his hands. "But I know that when a man has been building on a false foundation long enough, and the foundation shifts, the whole structure tends to correct itself. Usually at once." Elizabeth was quiet. She thought about John Sayers, laid off after 12 years, standing in her yard with his hat in his hands. She thought about the Haverford family, nearly swindled out of a grandfather's trust. She thought about Carter Hall, the ring, the room, the silence, her mother's muffled sob. She thought about the tobacco warehouse workers, still on the job working on a building with a foundation poured wrong. That last thought was the one that moved her. "The workers," she said. "If the foundation fails." "It's a structural risk," Reed said quietly. "Yes." She looked at him. "I'm not doing this for me," she said. "I know," he said. "I mean it. I need you to know I mean it." "Elizabeth." His voice was very calm. "I know." She took a breath. "Write the letter to Aldrich," she said. "I'll write the one to the bank, and send Thomas Giles, the Haverford lawyer, send him the warehouse assessment. He'll know what to do with it." Reed picked up his pen. She was back on the Caldwell land when it started to move. It was a Tuesday afternoon in mid-December, cold and clear, and she was with John Sayers, working through the drainage plan for the lower section, when she heard a horse coming fast from the direction of town. Fast enough that Sayers looked up too. The rider was James Haverford. How was not performing urgency? He was actually urgent. She could see it in the way he'd pushed the horse in the set of his jaw when he pulled up and swung down. "Miss Whitmore," he said. He was slightly out of breath. "You need to know what's happening." She waited. "Aldrich's office sent 2 men to Carter's tobacco warehouse this morning," James said. "With a structural engineer from the state." He looked at her steadily. "They found exactly what they found, what the assessment described. The east foundation wall is compromised. They've halted construction." Sayers had gone very still beside her. "Anyone hurt?" Elizabeth asked immediately. "No, they cleared the workers first." James took a breath. "But that's not all. The bank in Richmond, they sent their own man down yesterday. He's been at Carter Hall since this morning." He paused. "Nathaniel knows it was him who was misrepresented to. He knows Giles went back to the bank. He knows—" James stopped. "He's been asking who put it all together." Elizabeth looked at him. "What are people telling him?" she asked. "The truth," James said. "That you shared public documents, that you wrote an honest account of what the records showed." He held her gaze. "That you didn't lie about a single thing." She looked at the Caldwell field. She thought about Nathaniel asking her in the East field, "Was this your revenge?" And her answer, "No. Revenge was watching you fall. Justice was allowing your own choices to reveal who you were." She had believed that when she said it. She still believed it. But standing here now with the knowledge that the warehouse had been halted and the bank had sent men to Carter Hall, and the whole machinery of consequence was turning, she felt something she hadn't quite let herself feel before. Not satisfaction, that wasn't the word. Something older and quieter than that. Relief, not for herself. For the workers who wouldn't be standing under a compromised wall when it shifted. For Catherine Haverford, who had sat across from her and been honest at personal cost. For John Sayers, whose 12 years of service had been discarded as casually as a seasonal inconvenience. For the record simply being set right. "Thank you for telling me," she said to James. He nodded. He didn't move to leave. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "I'd like to, that is, I was wondering if—" He stopped, tried again. "I know this is not the moment, and if you'd rather I didn't." "Spit it out, Mr. Haverford," she said. He almost smiled. "I would like to call on you, properly, if you'd be willing." He looked at her with the directness she had come to expect from him. No performance, no strategy. Just the straightforward admission of a man who had made up his mind about something and was being honest about it. Not as an investor, as a— He stopped. "Well, as a man who finds you considerably more interesting than anyone else he has encountered in Virginia." Sayers had suddenly become extremely absorbed in the drainage line. Elizabeth looked at James Haverford. She thought about Carter Hall. About trust and what it cost when it was misplaced. About the ring on a table and her grandmother's pearl earrings, and the specific loneliness of a woman who had been weighed and found wanting by a man who was himself false all the way down. She thought about the cedar box on her desk full of things she had built from nothing. She thought about the fact that she did not need anyone's name, anyone's money, anyone's rescue. And she thought that James Haverford, who had come to her with a specific proposal and admitted when he didn't know something, and sent his sister to deliver a document that cost her something to carry. James Haverford had never once looked at her the way Nathaniel had. Not like a ledger entry, like a person. "You may call on me," she said. "Properly." He pulled off his hat, held it. He looked not triumphant, not relieved in the way a man looked when he'd gotten something he wanted. He looked like a man who understood he'd been given something valuable and intended to be careful with it. "Thank you," he said quietly. She turned back to the drainage line. "Now," she said, "unless you have knowledge of field drainage that Sayers and I lack, I suggest you ride back to town and let us work." He laughed. It was a real laugh, surprised and genuine, the kind that came out before a person could decide whether to let it. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He mounted and rode back toward town. Sayers, still studying the drainage line with great intensity, said, "He seems decent." "He does," Elizabeth agreed. Carter never could have laughed at himself like that. "No," she said. He couldn't. She made a note in her book. They kept working. That evening, she sat at her desk with the cedar box open in front of her. She took out each document in turn. The Aldrich letter. The Caldwell deed. Dorothea's wool proposal. Thomas Reed's drainage assessment. Catherine Haverford's copy of Nathaniel's letter to his lawyer. She laid them out on the desk and looked at them. A year ago, she had sat in this same room and looked at her hands and felt for the first time the particular clear-headedness that came from having nothing left to lose. She had not known then what she would build. She had not had a plan. She had only had the quiet, stubborn conviction that the story Nathaniel Carter had told the county about her was not the true one, and that the true one was hers to tell. She looked at what she had built. Outside the December dark, pressed against the windows, and somewhere in Richmond, a banker was reviewing documents about a compromised warehouse and a mortgaged Southfield, and the systematic misrepresentation of a man who had stood up in front of all of Virginia and announced that he was too ambitious to be held back by small things. Elizabeth gathered the documents carefully. She put them back in the cedar box. She closed the lid. She picked up her pen and opened her account book to tomorrow's page. There was still a great deal of work to do. The bank's men left Carter Hall on a Thursday. Elizabeth knew because John Sayers heard it from the feed merchant, who had heard it from the Carter stable hand, who had watched two men in good coats climb into a Richmond carriage with a leather satchel full of documents and not look back. Nathaniel had stood on the front steps and watched them go. The stable hand said he hadn't moved for a long time after the carriage cleared the gate. Elizabeth received this information over breakfast relayed by Sayers, with the careful neutrality of a man who understood he was telling her something significant and didn't want to color it with his own feelings about it. She nodded. She finished her coffee. She went out to the Caldwell field. She had learned over the past year that the best antidote to the pull of other people's disasters was the immediate and practical weight of her own work. The lower drainage project was at a critical stage. They were digging the main channel that would redirect water away from the low southeast corner. And if they hit a problem with the clay layer 2 feet down, the whole plan would need to be adjusted before the ground froze solid. She didn't have time to stand still and watch Nathaniel Carter's life come apart. She had clay to contend with. They hit the clay layer at 22 inches. Softer than I expected, Sayers said, crouching down and pressing a thumb into it. Which means it'll drain faster, Elizabeth said. Which means the channel doesn't need to go as deep. He looked at her. Which means we finish before Christmas. She looked at the channel. She thought about the revised drainage plan sitting on her desk, the one she'd worked through 3 times to account for every variable she could think of. Let's finish before Christmas, she said. They kept digging. The first real indication that the county's understanding of things had shifted came not from Margaret or Thomas Reed, but from Mrs. Pruitt herself. She stopped Elizabeth after Sunday service, not the tentative cautious pause of a woman maintaining minimal courtesy, but a deliberate stop a hand on Elizabeth's arm, a look that carried something Mrs. Pruitt had never previously aimed in Elizabeth's direction, respect. I heard about the warehouse, Mrs. Pruitt said. Without preamble, without any of the social softening she normally wrapped every statement in. It was halted, Elizabeth said. Yes, my nephew works that site. Mrs. Pruitt's voice was careful. He was there when the state men came. He told me. She stopped. He said the foreman knew about the foundation 2 months ago, said someone had raised it and been told to be quiet. She looked at Elizabeth directly. He said if it had gone up another season without being caught, the whole east wall could have come down. Elizabeth held her gaze. I'm glad it was caught then. Mrs. Pruitt pressed her lips together. My nephew has a wife and a new baby, she said. He needs his work. I told him I might know someone who needed good hands for a spring operation. Elizabeth looked at her. Mrs. Pruitt, who had looked through her at church for the better part of a year. Mrs. Pruitt, whose carefully maintained courtesy had been the county's social temperature made visible. Send him to me, Elizabeth said. I'll talk to him. Mrs. Pruitt nodded. She released Elizabeth's arm. She walked back toward her family with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had said what she needed to say and considered the matter settled. Elizabeth's mother appeared at her elbow. "Was that Mrs. Pruitt?" her mother said with the stunned air of someone witnessing weather behave unexpectedly. "It was," Elizabeth said. "She touched your arm." "She did." Her mother was quiet for a moment. "Well," she said finally. "Well." They walked to the carriage. Thomas Reed came to the house on the following Wednesday with a face Elizabeth had learned to read as his complicated face, the one that meant the news was neither fully good nor fully simple, and he was deciding how to lay it out. She put the kettle on herself because her mother was out. "Sit down, Thomas," she said. He sat. He waited until she had set 2 cups on the table and settled across from him. "The bank has moved on the south field," he said. "Formally, they've filed the notice." He folded his hands on the table. "Nathaniel has 30 days to either settle the full loan amount or surrender the parcel." Elizabeth was quiet. "He can't settle it," she said. "No, he can't." Reed's voice was measured. "He's been liquidating where he can. Sold the Philadelphia equipment order before it shipped, took a loss on the deposit. Let go of the rest of the warehouse staff." He paused. "The Dalton acreage, the north parcel, the expansion land. He's put it up for private sale, quietly. But word gets around." She thought about the Dalton acreage. 200 acres north of the river. The purchase that had started all of it. The overreach that had required Catherine Haverford's grandfather's trust to sustain, that had required Elizabeth's erasure to make room for. 200 acres that had cost more than they were worth and delivered less than promised, and were now being sold quietly at a loss to keep the rest from following. "What about Carter Hall itself?" she asked. Reed's expression shifted in the small, specific way it shifted when a thing was more serious than he wanted to lead with. "Not yet," he said. "But if the Southfield goes and the Dalton sale doesn't cover the warehouse debt—" He stopped. "The hall is the last significant asset. If the math doesn't work, the bank will eventually look at it." Elizabeth wrapped her hands around her cup. She thought about Carter Hall blazing with candles on a summer evening. She thought about the ring on his palm. She thought about Nathaniel believing so completely in his own forward motion that he had never once turned around to check what he was leaving behind. "He did this to himself," she said. It wasn't absolution. It wasn't grief either. It was simply the fact of it named plainly. "He did," Reed said. They sat with that for a moment. "There's something else," Reed said. She looked at him. "He's been asking to speak with Aldrich," Reed said carefully. "Through channels. He wants a meeting. He believes, or he's been telling people he believes, that there was a coordinated effort to undermine his commercial standing. That documents were misused. That he was the target of a deliberate campaign." He paused. "He's named you." Elizabeth was completely still. "He's named me," she said. "He suggested to at least 3 people that you acted out of personal spite. That the sharing of those documents was motivated by—" Reed stopped. His word was vengeance. She looked at the table. She thought about the letter she had written to Aldrich's office, the careful, factual, measured letter with nothing in it she could not support, and nothing that asked anyone to believe anything except what the numbers said. She thought about Reed reading it in his doorway, no qualifications, no apology for inexperience. She thought about Margaret. "Don't let the fear of looking foolish make you look small." "Does Aldrich believe him?" she asked. "No," Reed said. "Aldrich has seen the documents. He knows what you submitted and what it contained." He paused. "But Nathaniel is making noise. And noise, even groundless noise, has a way of requiring a response." Elizabeth picked up her cup, set it down. "Then we respond," she said. She went to Aldrich directly. Not through his secretary. Not through a careful letter managed for tone and implication. She sent word to his Richmond office that she would be in the city on Friday and asked if he had 40 minutes. The reply came back in 2 days. He had an hour. She rode to Richmond with Thomas Reed, who sat across from her in the carriage, with a calm that she recognized as his version of nerves, perfectly composed on the surface, hands folded with unusual precision, saying very little. "You don't need to coach me," she said. "I know," he said. "Then stop looking like you want to." He almost smiled. "Tell the truth in the order it happened," he said. "That's all. Just that." "That's what I've been doing for a year, Thomas." "I know," he said again. "That's why we're here." Aldrich's office was on the second floor of a building that smelled of beeswax and old paper. The specific smell of a place where decisions got made and recorded, and occasionally regretted. Aldrich himself was 61, gray-haired, with the sharp, patient eyes of a man who had spent 40 years watching other people make their cases, and had developed an instinct for which ones were solid. He looked at Elizabeth when she came in, the way he had looked at her briefly at Carter Hall, with the particular assessment of a man filing something away for later. He shook her hand. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I've been wanting to meet you properly." "Senator," she said, "I appreciate the time." He waved that off. He sat. "Carter came to my office 2 weeks ago," he said without preamble. "He made a number of claims about the nature of your involvement in his current difficulties. I listened to all of them." He paused. "Then I went back through every document your lawyer's office submitted to mine. I read every line." He looked at her. "I want to hear from you what you did in your own words, and why." Elizabeth looked at him steadily. "I shared public records," she said. "Land filings, mortgage documents, bank correspondence that was already part of the county record." She paused. "The Haverford family's lawyer received a letter that laid out what the public record showed about the Carter financial position. I wrote that letter. It contained no speculation, no opinion, nothing that required anyone to trust my judgment over the evidence itself." She paused. "I wrote to your office in the same manner. I reported what a structural engineer's assessment of the warehouse indicated, an assessment that John Sayers, who had worked that site, had raised internally and been told to ignore." Aldrich said nothing. "I'll tell you why I did it," she said before he could ask. "Not to harm Nathaniel Carter. Not out of spite or vengeance. I did it because workers were on a compromised structure. Because a family was about to be defrauded of a land trust. Because a bank was holding a mortgage against land that had been misrepresented in its condition." She held his gaze. "I did it because the information was true, and the people who needed it didn't have it. That's all." Aldrich studied her for a long moment. "Carter says," he said slowly, "that no woman of your standing and situation would have had the means or the knowledge to compile what you compiled without help from parties interested in his ruin. Carter," Elizabeth said, "has consistently underestimated what a woman of my standing and situation is capable of when she has sufficient motivation and access to a county records office." Aldrich blinked. Then, without warning, he laughed. A real one, short and surprised, the laugh of a man who had not expected to be amused. He recovered himself. He looked at her with something that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. "Thomas Reed's assessment of your competence," he said, "turns out to have been conservative." "Thomas is cautious by nature," Elizabeth said. "It's one of his best qualities." Aldrich leaned back. He pressed his fingers together. He looked at her with the considering expression of a man making a final determination about something. "Carter's claims will go nowhere," he said. "I'll make that clear through the appropriate channels." He paused. "The survey, the eastern parcels. I want to move forward with that in March as planned. Your role stands." He looked at her. "I'll be honest with you, Miss Whitmore, when my secretary first mentioned your name, I thought it was a courtesy gesture, something to smooth things over in the county after an unpleasant business." "And now?" she asked. "Now," he said. "I think the Eastern Parcel Survey is going to be the most accurately documented land assessment this state has conducted in 30 years. He stood, extended his hand. "I look forward to working with you." She shook it. Reed was waiting in the corridor. She came out, and he looked at her face, and his shoulders dropped about half an inch with relief. "Well," he said. "The survey is still on," she said, "and Carter's claims are finished." He let out a breath. "How did it go?" She considered. "He laughed," she said, "at something I said." Reed blinked. Aldrich laughed. "He did." Reed looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating his understanding of an entire situation. "Good God," he said quietly. You're going to be fine. Thomas, she said, I've been fine. Nathaniel came on a January morning. She was at her desk when she heard the horse, a sound she had learned to identify over the past months without looking up from her work. The particular rhythm of hooves and the specific way they stopped that told her something about the purpose of the rider. This stop was different from the last time, less certain. The last time he had come, he had ridden up to the fence line of the east field with the energy of a man who still believed he had standing. This time the horse stopped in the yard, and there was a long pause before she heard boots on the ground. She made herself finish the paragraph she was writing before she went to the door. He was standing in the yard. He had not knocked. She thought he hadn't been sure he was going to come in, had maybe ridden out here, not entirely certain what he intended to do when he arrived. He looked worse than the last time. Not dramatically, he was still dressed well, still carried himself with the posture of a Carter. But there was something gone from him that had been there before. Something she had once identified as certainty, and was only now able to name more precisely the certainty of a man who had never had to wonder whether the world would accommodate him. That certainty was gone. In its place was something rawer and more human. She stood in the doorway and looked at him. Elizabeth, he said. She waited. I went to Aldrich, he said. I thought, he stopped. I told him you'd done this deliberately, that you had, he stopped again, looked at his hands. He told me to go home. I know, she said. He looked up. You know, I was there 2 days before you, she said. I told him the truth. That's all I did. He was quiet for a moment. The Southfield notice came, he said. 30 days. She said nothing. The Dalton land, I have a buyer, but the price? He stopped. It won't cover the warehouse debt. He looked at her, not with the calculation she had learned to recognize in him, with something else. I wanted you to know that I understand. His voice was quiet, stripped of the practiced cadences she'd grown up hearing in it. I understand what I did, not just to you, all of it. The way I... He stopped. Carter Hall. Elizabeth looked at him steadily. She thought about every version of this moment she had imagined over the past year and a half. She had imagined it more than she wanted to admit in those first weeks, especially when grief was still sharper than resolve. She had let herself picture it. The apology. The recognition. The moment when he understood. She had thought it would feel like something. Standing here now, she found that it felt like almost nothing at all. Not coldness, she wasn't cold toward him. Not triumph. Something much quieter and more final than either. The feeling of a door that had been standing ajar for a long time, being gently, firmly closed. Why did you come? She asked. He looked at her. I don't know, he said. Honestly, it was possibly the most honest thing he had ever said to her. I think I wanted to ask if... He stopped. Was there a version of this that didn't end here where I didn't? No, she said, quietly, not cruelly, just completely. There wasn't. He absorbed that. You deserved better than what I did, he said. I know that, she said. I've known it since I walked out of that room. He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him trying to find something in her expression, some trace of the woman she'd been before Carter Hall, the woman who had believed in him, the woman whose belief he had stood up in front of a room full of people and publicly discarded. He wasn't going to find her. That woman had been replaced by someone considerably more clear-eyed and considerably less willing to be accommodated out of her own instincts. The girl herself is manageable, she said quietly. He went absolutely still. You've seen the letter, he said. Catherine gave it to me, she said. She brought it herself. Something moved across his face, shame, she thought. The particular belated shame of a man who has had his private thinking made visible and can no longer pretend it was more generous than it was. I never meant, he started. Yes, you did, she said. Not angry, just accurate. You meant exactly what you wrote. I wasn't a person to you. I was a liability you needed to trade up from. Catherine was an asset you needed to acquire. She held his gaze. You never meant to be cruel, Nathaniel. You just never thought about anyone clearly enough to know what cruelty was." He said nothing. There was nothing to say to that. They both knew it was true. "Go home," she said. "Handle what you can handle. Make whatever arrangements the situation requires." She stepped back slightly. "That's my advice, for whatever it's worth coming from me." He put his hat back on. He looked at her one last time. She saw it, the full, complete comprehension of what he had walked away from. Not Elizabeth Whitmore, the girl he'd considered insufficient. Elizabeth Whitmore, the woman standing in a doorway she owned, who had spent a year building something from the rubble of what he'd done, and had come out the other side of it clearer and stronger, and so entirely herself, that looking at her was almost uncomfortable. The comprehension arrived late, the way it always did for men like him. But it arrived completely. "Goodbye, Elizabeth," he said. "Goodbye, Nathaniel," she said. He walked to his horse. He mounted. He rode back down the lane without looking back. She stood in the doorway and watched him go, not out of any lingering feeling for him, but because she wanted to be sure to mark the moment precisely, to know exactly when it was over. The lane was empty. She went back inside. Margaret came that afternoon, as if she had some internal sense for when Elizabeth needed both company and the particular kind of company that did not require her to explain herself. She brought 2 pieces of excellent pie from somewhere and sat at Elizabeth's kitchen table and set one in front of her without comment. Elizabeth sat down. She ate some pie. "He came," she said. "I know," Margaret said. "How do you know?" "I was at the feed merchant when he rode past." Margaret ate a bite of her own pie with calm satisfaction. "How did he look?" Elizabeth thought about it. "Human," she said. "For maybe the first time since I've known him." Margaret nodded. "Ruin will do that to a man. It strips the performance off. Some of them become something better underneath." She paused. "Some don't." "I don't know which he'll be," Elizabeth said. "I found that I don't need to know." Margaret looked at her across the table. "No," she said. "You don't." They finished the pie. January moved into February with the particular stubbornness of a Virginia winter that had decided it wasn't finished yet. The ground stayed hard. The survey work that was supposed to begin in March was pushed to late March, and Elizabeth spent the extra weeks finishing the wool operation proposal, with Dorothea, reviewing the Caldwell drainage results with Sayers, and receiving on a quiet Tuesday a formal visit from Mrs. Pruitt's nephew, who turned out to be a solid and careful young man with genuine knowledge of construction materials and a willingness to learn soil work that Elizabeth found useful. She hired him. She heard through the ordinary channels of county information that Nathaniel had found a buyer for the Dalton acreage. Not a good price. Sayers knew the number through the feed merchant and relayed it to her with the neutral expression of a man delivering weather, but enough combined with what remained of his liquid assets to settle the warehouse debt. The south field was surrendered to the bank. The tobacco warehouse project was abandoned. The half-finished structure on the river stood empty through the winter, a monument to a plan that had never been as solid as the man behind it had insisted. Carter Hall itself remained, for now. She did not take satisfaction in any of this in the way she had once imagined she might. She had imagined in the early weeks after Carter Hall that vindication would feel large, that it would have a shape and a sound and a particular brightness to it that would be unmistakable. Instead, it felt like relief, like the easing of a pressure she had grown so accustomed to that she had stopped noticing it was there. Like setting down something heavy after a very long walk and finding that her hands remembered what it was to be empty. James Haverford came to call twice in January as promised. He came at the right time of day, stayed the right length of time, talked with her father about crops, and with her about land law, and with her mother about the kind of neutral, easy things that good men talked about with mothers when they were trying to make a sincere impression. He did not perform. He did not strategize. He brought himself and left the rest out of it. And Elizabeth found somewhat to her own surprise that she was glad when she heard his horse on the lane. She didn't rush anything. She had no intention of rushing anything. Trust was not a thing you built in a season, and she had learned it exactly once, which was exactly once more than most people needed what it cost when you built it too fast on a foundation that hadn't been examined. She let it move slowly. She paid attention. The survey was confirmed for the last week of March. 2 days before it was scheduled to begin, Thomas Reed came to the house with a letter from Aldrich's office. Not from the secretary this time, from Aldrich himself. She read it at her desk. It was brief. Aldrich was not a man who used more words than he needed. He wrote that the Eastern Parcel Survey would serve as a model for a broader state initiative, an effort to bring the county land records into comprehensive, accurate order before the next legislative session. He wrote that he intended to recommend to the appropriate committee that the methodology Elizabeth had developed for the Caldwell acquisition proposal be adopted as a standard framework for agricultural yield assessment in the region. He wrote in the last paragraph in the plain language of a man who had decided something and saw no reason to dress it in ceremony. Miss Whitmore's contributions to this survey and to the accurate representation of commercial conduct in this county have been of greater value to this state than most people who hold formal office will manage in a decade. I intend to say so in those words to the committee. Elizabeth set the letter down. She sat very still for a moment. She thought about her mother in the carriage on the way home from Carter Hall. The invitations and her own voice cutting her off will manage. She thought about Thomas Reed's face in his office doorway, reading the Caldwell proposal saying, "You're the best reader of land in this county." She thought about Margaret arriving without announcement and saying things that needed saying. She thought about John Sayers hat in hand in the yard, deciding in a single nod that she was worth working for. She thought about the east field at dawn, the clay layer at 22 inches, the drainage channel finished before Christmas. She thought about a ring on a table and a room full of people and a man who had believed completely that she was insufficient. She picked up her pen. She wrote back to Aldrich with the precise, measured warmth of a woman who knew her own worth and no longer required anyone else's confirmation of it, though she received it this time with something that was not quite gratitude and not quite pride, but lived in the country between them. When she finished the letter, she sealed it, set it with the outgoing correspondence, and opened her account book. The spring planting schedule needed to be finalized. Sayers had a question about the seed order. Dorothea's wool operation was ready to move from proposal to action. Mrs. Pruitt's nephew needed his first week's instructions. There was still a great deal of work to do. Elizabeth Whitmore rolled up her sleeves and did it. The Eastern Parcel Survey began on a Tuesday in late March, when the ground had softened enough to work, and the air still carried the particular sharp clarity of a winter that hadn't quite decided to leave. Elizabeth was there before the state men arrived. She had ridden out at first light with her notebooks and her measurements from the previous fall, and she was already walking the boundary line of the first parcel when she heard the Richmond carriage come up the road. 2 surveyors, a recorder, and a man from Aldrich's office named Connell, who had the organized, slightly harried energy of someone who had been told to make sure everything went correctly and took that instruction personally. He introduced himself. He shook her hand with the brief, businesslike efficiency of a man who had been briefed on who she was and had decided to treat her accordingly, which is to say, as a professional equal and not as an unusual circumstance requiring special management. She appreciated that more than she could easily explain. "I've read your Caldwell methodology," Connell said as they walked the first parcel together. "The yield projection framework. Aldrich said to tell you we're using it as the template." "I heard," she said. "I'm glad it's useful." "It's better than useful," he said. "It's the first framework I've seen that accounts for drainage variance in the yield estimate. Every other model I've worked with treats drainage as a fixed condition." He looked at her. "Where did you learn to account for it?" "The East Field," she said. "The hard way." He nodded, as if that was the most sensible answer he'd heard all week. They worked through the morning with the focused, satisfying rhythm of people who are good at what they do and have the rare good fortune of working alongside others who are equally good. The state recorder, a quiet man named Fitch, took notes with a precision that Elizabeth found almost aesthetically pleasing. The 2 surveyors moved efficiently and asked intelligent questions. By midday, they had completed 3 parcels and were ahead of schedule. Connell ate his lunch, standing up, reading back through his notes. Miss Whitmore, he said without looking up. What's your read on the Hollis parcel, the northwest corner near the creek? She had walked that corner in November. She told him what she'd found: the water table, the soil condition, what she estimated for spring yield if properly managed, and what she estimated if the current owner kept doing what he'd been doing for the past 4 years. Connell made a note. You assessed that in November, he said, before you knew you'd be part of this survey. I assess everything I can reach, she said. It seemed like useful information to have. He looked up at her with the expression of a man who had been doing this work long enough to know the difference between someone who was thorough and someone who was exceptional. He went back to his notes. Elizabeth went back to work. The news about Carter Hall came on the 4th day of the survey. She was mid-measurement on the 2nd parcel of the morning when Fitch, who had ridden back to town for additional recording paper, returned with the slightly overstimulated look of a man who had heard something significant and was deciding whether it was his place to mention it. Elizabeth made the decision for him. What happened? She asked. Fitch looked at Connell. Connell nodded slightly. Carter Hall, Fitch said. The bank's put up a notice. It's going to sale. Elizabeth went still. Not with shock. She had known mathematically that this was a possible outcome. She had watched the arithmetic of Nathaniel's situation for months and understood that the Southfield and the Dalton land and the warehouse debt taken together constituted more than a setback. She had known. Knowing and hearing it spoken plainly were different things. When? She asked. Notice went up this morning, Fitch said. Summer auction if no private buyer comes forward. She looked at the parcel in front of her. She looked at her notebook. She thought about Nathaniel standing in her yard in January putting his hat back on. Goodbye, Elizabeth. The comprehension in his face. She took a breath. All right, she said. Let's keep moving. Connell looked at her for a moment, not intrusively. Just long enough to register that she had received significant news and set it aside with a composure that he clearly found worth noting. Then he looked back at his own work. They kept moving. She told her parents at supper. Her father set down his fork. He was quiet for a moment. Carter Hall, he said. Yes. He picked his fork back up. His grandfather built that house, he said. 60 years ago, maybe more. He was quiet again. Nathaniel was born there. I know, Elizabeth said. Her mother had gone very still on the other side of the table. Lizzie, her mother said carefully. Do you feel... She stopped. Are you all right? Elizabeth thought about the question honestly. I feel sad for the house, she said. Not for him, for the house. She paused. A house doesn't choose who lives in it. Her mother looked at her with the particular layered expression she had been wearing more and more often in the past year. The expression of a woman recognizing that her daughter had become someone she hadn't imagined, and finding, despite the occasional bewilderment of it, that she was proud. You're a strange creature, her mother said. Not unkindly, with affection actually. Yes, Elizabeth agreed. I reckon I am. Her father made a sound that was very nearly a laugh. They finished supper. James came the following Sunday. He came at the right time, as he always did, with the horse properly hitched and his hat off before he was fully through the door. Her mother received him with the warm, slightly over-enthusiastic courtesy she had adopted toward him since approximately his 3rd visit, and her father shook his hand with the straightforward approval of a man who had been watching carefully and had made his assessment. Elizabeth brought him outside. They walked the perimeter of the home fields, not the Caldwell land, not anything formal, just the familiar ground she had walked her whole life, which she had lately been seeing differently. Seeing it the way you saw something when you understood for the first time that it was yours. Really yours. Not by inheritance or assumption, but by the daily labor of understanding it. I heard about Carter Hall, James said when they'd been walking a few minutes. Everyone has, she said. How are you? She glanced at him. He asked it the way he asked most things, directly, without dressing it up in social cushion. Not how are you as a courtesy. How are you as an actual question requiring an actual answer? Strange, she said. I thought I'd feel more when it happened. When it was finally final. She paused. I mostly feel like I want to get the spring planting right. He was quiet for a moment. That's probably healthy. Margaret says so. Margaret Ellis is a wise woman. He glanced at her. She told my sister last month that you were the most competent person she'd worked with in 30 years, man or woman. Elizabeth looked at him. Margaret said that to Catherine. At the Crane woman's dinner, in front of several people apparently. He tilted his head. You didn't know. Margaret doesn't tell me things like that, Elizabeth said. She tells me what I'm doing wrong. That's how I know she respects me. James laughed. She had come to love the way he laughed, the same way she had noticed it the first time in the Caldwell field, surprised and genuine, the kind that didn't ask permission. There was nothing performed in James Haverford. She had tested that quietly in the months of his calling, had watched for the seams between what he showed and what he was, the way she now automatically watched for seams in everything. She hadn't found any. That didn't mean there weren't any. She was clear-eyed enough to know that. It meant she hadn't found any, which was a different thing. She was paying attention. I want to ask you something, he said. He stopped walking. She stopped too. He looked at her with the directness that was his most distinctive quality, the look of a man who had made up his mind to say a thing and was going to say it without wrapping it in safety first. I know this isn't. I know the timing is complicated, he said. With everything that's still settling. I know you've spent a year building something that's yours and no one else's, and the last thing you need is someone coming along and making it about them. He paused. I know all of that. Then say the rest of it, she said. He looked at her. I'd like to court you properly, he said. Not as an investor, not as a neighbor, as a man who has been paying attention to you for the better part of a year and who thinks you are. He stopped. I think you are singular, Elizabeth. I think there is no one else in this county, or likely in this state, quite like you. And I think that if you'll allow it, I'd like the chance to prove that I understand what that means and what it requires. He held her gaze. No ledger entries, no calculations, just honest intention plainly stated. She looked at him for a long time. She thought about the ring on a table. She thought about trust and what it had cost and what it still cost when she let herself think about it honestly. She thought about the cedar box on her desk, full of things she had built herself. She thought about the way he'd looked the first time he'd come back with a specific proposal and admitted when he didn't know something. The way he had laughed at himself in the Caldwell field. The way he talked to her father, not through him, not around him, but to him as one reasonable man to another. She thought about the way he'd asked, "How are you?" and waited for the real answer. I know what it requires, she said quietly. I need to know that you do. Tell me, he said, simply, without defensiveness. I won't be managed, she said. I won't be accommodated out of my own judgment. I won't be loved for being small or quiet or easy, because I am none of those things, and I have no intention of becoming them. She held his gaze. What I've built is mine. What I build next is mine. I'm willing to build alongside someone who understands that. I'm not willing to do anything else. He was quiet for a moment. My grandmother, he said, ran the Haverford, Philadelphia accounts for 20 years, while my grandfather handled the Virginia land. He said once that the smartest decision he ever made was getting out of her way while she worked. He looked at her. I grew up watching that. I know what it looks like when a woman is capable, and what it costs when the people around her pretend she isn't. He paused. I have no interest in pretending. She looked at him. She believed him. Not blindly, she did not do things blindly anymore. But she believed him with the specific calibrated trust of a woman who had learned to read evidence and had been reading him carefully for months. The evidence pointed the same direction consistently. That meant something. All right, she said. He looked at her. All right, you'll let me court you. All right, I'll stop pretending I haven't already made up my mind, she said. He stared at her for a moment. Then that laugh again, surprised and real, and entirely his own. You've known for how long? He said. A while, she said. I was being careful. You were being careful, he repeated. I'm always careful, she said. Ask Thomas Reed. He shook his head, still smiling, and they walked back toward the house in the March light, with the particular ease of two people who have said what they needed to say and no longer have to carry the weight of not saying it. The summer brought three things that Elizabeth would remember the rest of her life. The first was the survey completion. Connell presented the final report to Aldrich's committee in June, and Elizabeth's name appeared in the methodology section as primary architect of the yield assessment framework, not thanked, not acknowledged as a contributor, but named as the creator of a tool the state intended to use going forward. Connell sent her a copy with a brief note. "Your work will outlast both of us. Good work tends to." She put the note in the cedar box. The second thing was the wool operation. Dorothea Crane had been as good as her word, and Elizabeth had been as good as her proposal, and by midsummer, the lower Caldwell field had 12 sheep and a processing setup that was small and efficient and already profitable at a scale neither of them had quite dared to project on paper. Dorothea came out one afternoon to check the first season's numbers, and stood in the field and looked at what they had built and said in her dry Connecticut manner, "I've worked with 3 business partners in my life. You're the first one who's been right about everything." "I wasn't right about the feed costs," Elizabeth said. "Close enough," Dorothea said. "Don't be tedious." The third thing was Carter Hall. It went to auction on a Wednesday in July. Elizabeth did not go. She did not need to go. She heard about it through Thomas Reed, who had attended as a professional observer, and came to her house the following day with a look that contained, she thought, something she hadn't seen in him before. Something like wonder. "Who bought it?" she asked. Reed sat down. He took a breath. "A woman," he said. "From Philadelphia, widowed. Her late husband was in shipping, left her a considerable estate." He paused. "She bought it for the land, apparently. She intends to build a school." Elizabeth looked at him. "A school," she said. "A girls' school," Reed said. "She's been looking for a suitable property for 2 years. She told the auctioneer, Carter Hall has the best layout she's seen for her purposes." He held Elizabeth's gaze. She paid a fair price. The bank settled its claims. Nathaniel received the remainder. He paused. Not much remained. Elizabeth was quiet. She thought about Carter Hall blazing with candles. She thought about the ring. She thought about the room full of watching faces. She thought about a girls' school in the house where Nathaniel Carter had stood up in front of all of Virginia and declared that what was small could be discarded. "Good," she said. It was the only word she had for it, but it was the right one, and she meant it completely. Nathaniel left the county in August. He went to Kentucky, according to report family there, distant cousins' land that was cheaper and less freighted with the weight of what he'd lost. He went quietly. No grand departure, no performance. A carriage, a trunk, and a road heading west. Elizabeth heard about it on a Thursday morning from her mother, who had heard it from Mrs. Pruitt, who had heard it from the feed merchant. The county's information network, reliable as ever. She was in the Caldwell field when she heard it. She was working. She stopped for a moment. She stood very still and let the information settle into its proper place. Not as a wound, not as a victory, just as a fact. A man had made choices, and the choices had carried him somewhere, and that somewhere was no longer here. She thought about what she had said to him in her doorway in January. Go home, handle what you can handle, make whatever arrangements the situation requires. She hoped he had. She hoped in the specific impersonal way you hoped things for strangers that he would find in Kentucky, something that made him better than he'd been in Virginia. She was done thinking about whether he would. That was his work, not hers. She picked up her notebook. She went back to work. The committee letter arrived in September. It was addressed to Miss Elizabeth Whitmore, which had become her professional name, the name on the survey, the name on the wool operation license, the name Thomas Reed used in his correspondence, the name Aldrich's office used without discussion or hesitation. She had not fought for it. She had simply kept using it, and the world had eventually adjusted. The letter was from the State Land Committee, following up on Aldrich's recommendation. They were establishing a formal advisory panel for the Eastern District's land and agricultural development. They wanted 3 regional consultants. One of these positions, the one covering yield assessment and soil analysis, was being offered to her. The letter was 2 paragraphs long. It named a stipend. It named a term of 2 years renewable. It asked for a written response within 30 days. She read it twice. She set it on her desk. She sat for a moment in the particular weighted quiet of someone who has received something they worked for and is taking the time to actually feel it instead of immediately moving to the next thing. She thought about her father saying your grandfather assumed he meant by a son. She thought about Thomas Reed's face reading the Caldwell proposal. She thought about Margaret arriving without announcement and saying things that needed saying. She thought about Carter Hall and what it had cost and what it had given her and how it was impossible standing here to separate the two entirely. She thought about a girl who had ridden to a candlelit house in a pressed blue gown with her grandmother's pearl earrings and a heart full of something she had been afraid to name, and she felt not grief for her, but tenderness. That girl had not been wrong to trust. She had been wrong about who to trust, which was a different thing, and the difference had taken a year and a half of hard work to fully understand. She picked up her pen. She wrote her acceptance. Margaret came for tea that afternoon, which was becoming a regular Thursday occurrence that neither of them acknowledged as a regular occurrence, because Margaret would have found that sentimental. Elizabeth showed her the letter. Margaret read it, set it down, picked up her tea. 2 years renewable, Margaret said. Yes. You'll need to hire another hand for the Caldwell operation if you're splitting time between the field and the committee work. I've already been thinking about it, Elizabeth said. Sayers knows someone, his wife's brother, good with soil. Margaret nodded. And the Haverford boy. Elizabeth looked at her. What about him? Don't be coy, Margaret said. It doesn't suit you. Elizabeth smiled despite herself. We're courting, she said. Properly. I know, Margaret said. The whole county knows. The question is what you intend to do about it eventually. I intend to take my time, Elizabeth said, and make sure I'm choosing correctly, and not rush something that doesn't need rushing. She paused. He knows that. Does he mind? Margaret asked. No, Elizabeth said. He's paying attention. Margaret made the sound that was her version of approval. A small, precise exhale through her nose, the sound of someone who has found the answer she expected and is satisfied by its consistency. Good, she said. She drank her tea. Elizabeth drank hers. Outside, the September fields were beginning to take on the first faint gold of the turning season. The color that meant the summer's work was done, and the accounting of it could begin. The Caldwell land. The wool operation. The survey. The committee letter on the desk. She had built all of it in 18 months. From a ring on a table, and a room full of watching faces, and one clear, quiet, stubborn conviction that the story Nathaniel Carter had told about her was not the true one. This was the true one. In October, she hired 2 more people. Mrs. Pruitt's nephew, who had turned out to be exactly as solid as he'd seemed in that first conversation, and had spent the summer proving it consistently, was made permanent. And a young woman named Abby Sears, 17 years old, the daughter of the family on the adjacent parcel, who had been appearing at the fence line of the Caldwell field for 3 weeks, with the look of someone who had something to ask and hadn't yet worked up to asking it. Elizabeth had finally walked over to the fence herself. What is it? She asked. Abby Sears looked at her boots, then up. I heard you do figures, she said. Land figures. Yield calculations. I do, Elizabeth said. My father doesn't trust me with the account book, Abby said. He says it's not women's work. She paused. But I've been doing it anyway. In the evenings. I found 3 errors in the July harvest record. Elizabeth looked at her. She thought about Thomas Reed in his doorway saying, "You're the best reader of land in this county." She thought about Margaret arriving uninvited with something important to say. She thought about what it would have meant if someone had come to her fence line when she was 17. Come inside, she said. Show me the account book. Abby came inside. She showed her the book. The 3 errors were exactly what she said they were, and the way she'd found them, the specific instinctive methodology of a girl who thought in numbers, was the same methodology Elizabeth had been using for 2 years without ever having had anyone to teach it to her. She hired Abby Sears that afternoon. Her father objected. He came to the house the following morning with the stiff displeasure of a man whose authority has been quietly circumvented by his daughter and an unmarried neighbor woman. Elizabeth received him in the parlor. She was polite. She was immovable. "Abby found 3 errors in your harvest record," she said. "You nearly shorted yourself $40. She's going to keep doing this work. She can do it for me and learn from it, or she can do it for you without acknowledgement." She looked at him. "That's your choice, Mr. Sears." He left without committing to anything. He came back 3 days later and said in a voice that cost him something, "Don't let her work too late. She needs her sleep." "Of course," Elizabeth said. He left. Abby, who had been in the adjacent room and absolutely heard every word, appeared in the doorway. "That was you being diplomatic," she said. "That was me being firm," Elizabeth said. "There's a difference. You'll learn it." Abby sat down at the desk and opened her account book. Elizabeth sat down at hers. They worked. James proposed in November. Not in a grand way, not with performance or ceremony or an audience. He came on a Thursday evening when the light had gone early and the fire was up and her parents had retired and she was alone at her desk with the season's final accounts. He had a habit she had noticed of appearing in moments when she was working, not to interrupt her, not to draw her attention to himself, but because he understood that work was where she was most herself, and he wanted to be in the same room with that version of her. She had come to understand quietly that this was the thing she had been looking for without knowing how to name it. Not someone who needed her to be smaller, someone who wanted to be in the room with her full size. He sat down across the desk. He didn't say anything for a moment. She finished the line she was writing. She looked up. He was holding something in his hand. Not a ring, she noticed that immediately, and something in her chest unclenched without her fully deciding to let it. Not a ring. A small folded piece of paper. "What's that?" she asked. "A deed," he said. "A parcel in the western counties. Part of my grandmother's original Philadelphia holdings that came to me when she passed." He set it on the desk between them. "It needs the same kind of assessment you did on the Caldwell land. Soil analysis, drainage, yield projection." He looked at her. "I've been thinking that the only person I'd trust to do it correctly is you." He paused. "And I've been thinking that I'd like to spend the rest of my life in a position to say that, if you're willing." She looked at the deed. She looked at him. She thought about everything she had said to him in March. "I won't be managed. What I've built is mine. I need to know that you understand what that means." She thought about what he had said back, honest intention plainly stated. This was honest intention plainly stated. A deed, not a ring. A partnership, not a rescue. Work they could do together, because she was the right person to do it, not because he needed to feel like he was giving her something she couldn't find herself. She picked up the deed. She unfolded it. She read it. She looked up at him. "The drainage on the western corner is going to be complicated," she said. Something in his face, not relief exactly, but the particular loosening of a man whose heart has been in his throat and is now back where it belongs. "I suspected as much," he said. "I'll need to ride out and assess it before I can give you accurate projections." "I'll take you in the spring," he said, "after the survey season. The wool operation will need to be stable enough to run without me for 2 weeks. We'll plan accordingly," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said. "James, yes." He reached across the desk and took her hand. Not dramatically, not with grand feeling that required an audience to be real. Just firmly and carefully, the way you held something you understood was valuable and intended to be good to. She let him. They were married in the spring. Small. Her parents, Margaret Thomas Reed, Dorothea Crane, John Sayers, and his wife Abby Sears, who cried openly and without embarrassment. Catherine Haverford, who had sent a letter the previous fall with a single line at the end. "I am glad you found someone worth the trouble." James's family from Philadelphia, who had come down at considerable inconvenience and seemed upon meeting Elizabeth to immediately understand why James had been so particular about the matter. The ceremony was at the Whitmore home. Not a church, not because of any irreverence, but because the home was where all of it had started, and it seemed right to end this particular chapter where it had begun. Margaret gave a toast that lasted 45 seconds and contained no sentiment and was consequently the most affecting thing said all day. Elizabeth Whitmore, she said, holding her glass, built something in 2 years that most people don't build in a lifetime. She did it without permission, without advantage, and without softening her edges to make anyone comfortable. The man she chose to stand beside her today understands what that means. She looked at James. Don't let her down. She looked at Elizabeth. Don't let yourself down either. She drank. There was a pause. Then Thomas Reed started laughing, and it spread, and the room filled with it. Elizabeth stood in the middle of it and felt something she was only able to name later in the quiet of that evening, a fullness. Not the fullness of having everything she'd imagined. The fullness of having something real built from something true, held in her own 2 hands. 3 years after Carter Hall. A woman named Abby Sears brought her account book to Elizabeth Whitmore Haverford's study and set it on the desk. Abby was 20 now, still working with Elizabeth through the wool operation and the Caldwell farm, and she had the particular focused energy of a young woman who was beginning to understand what she was capable of and was still in the process of being astonished by it. I've been looking at the Pemberton parcel, Abby said without preamble. The one that's been sitting empty on the county's east boundary. Nobody's touched it in 4 years. She opened the book to a page of figures. I ran the yield estimates. Same framework you used for Caldwell. If the drainage issue on the south end gets addressed. She stopped. You should look at this. Elizabeth looked. She looked for a long time. She looked at the numbers, the way she had looked at the Caldwell numbers 2.5 years ago, not with excitement, not with urgency, but with the careful, thorough attention of a woman who knew how to read what was there and what it meant. The drainage will cost more than you've estimated, she said. There's a clay layer. You haven't accounted for it. Abby looked at the page, looked back up. How do you know there's a clay layer? Because there's always a clay layer, Elizabeth said. You learn to account for it. She slid the book back across the desk. Revise the drainage cost. Run it again. Bring it back to me tomorrow. Abby picked up the book. She stood. She looked at Elizabeth with the particular expression that Elizabeth was beginning to recognize, the expression of someone who was learning something that could not be taught in a classroom. Something that could only be acquired by watching a person who had already learned it the hard way and was generous enough to let you watch. Miss, Abby stopped. Mrs. Haverford, can I ask you something? You can ask, Elizabeth said. I may not answer. Were you ever afraid? Abby said. When you were starting out, when everything was... She paused. Were you ever afraid it wouldn't work? Elizabeth looked at her. She thought about the morning after Carter Hall, sitting in her room at 3 in the morning with the grief finally fully present, understanding what had been done and what it meant. She thought about the first time she'd walked into Thomas Reed's office and asked to understand land contracts as if she had any idea what she was doing. She thought about the first letter to Aldrich written 3 times before she got the tone right. She thought about every morning she had gotten out of bed and made herself move toward the thing she was building, not because she was certain it would work, but because the alternative was standing still and letting someone else's story about her become the only one. Every day, she said. I was afraid every single day. Abby looked at her. But you kept going. I kept going, Elizabeth said. Because being afraid and being stopped are 2 different things. You can be afraid and still pick up your pen. You can be afraid and still ride out to the field. You can be afraid... She paused. You can be afraid and still be exactly who you are. The fear doesn't change that. It just means you're paying attention. Abby stood with that for a moment. Then she nodded. Once the nod of someone who is filing something away, in the place where the important things go. Tomorrow, she said. Revised numbers. Tomorrow, Elizabeth agreed. Abby went. Elizabeth turned back to her desk. Through the window, the Virginia Spring was doing what Virginia Spring always did, insisting on itself, green and persistent, and entirely indifferent to the human dramas being conducted beneath it. The Caldwell Fields. The Whitmore Fields. The eastern parcels she had walked and measured and understood better than anyone else in 3 counties. The wool operation. The survey framework with her name in the methodology section. The cedar box still on the desk, still full. She opened her account book. She picked up her pen. There was still a great deal of work to do, and she had never been more certain of anything in her life than the knowledge that she was the right person to do it. She was Elizabeth Whitmore Haverford. She had been called insufficient by a man who had not understood the meaning of the word, and she had spent 2 years proving quietly and completely, and without asking anyone's permission, exactly what sufficient looked like. She wrote. Outside Virginia unfolded in every direction, wide and real and full of possibility, and it belonged in every way that mattered to the woman who had learned to read it.